Hello class, and welcome to part 2 of our nervous system lecture. This is on chapter 8, and we've divided it into 2 parts. We went over part 1 last week, and today this recorded lecture will be on part 2 of the nervous system. So we can divide your nervous system into your central nervous system, which consists of the brain and spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system, which consists of all the nerves. The ganglia are cell bodies of neurons outside of the brain and spinal cord. Here's a look at our spinal cord. It extends from the foramen magnum to L2, which is your second lumbar vertebra. It's protected by the vertebral column, which is your vertebrae bones. The spinal cord, the spinal nerves allow for movement. They come off of the spinal cord. And if damaged, paralysis can occur within the spinal cord, depending on what segment was damaged. Gray matter is the center of the spinal cord. Some people say it looks like the letter H or a butterfly, and white matter is the area outside of the spinal cord that contains the myelinated fibers. The white matter in the spinal cord is located in the white matter of the central nervous system are 3 columns, also called funiculi. The columns contain ascending and descending tracts of neurons, so going to the brain and from the brain. The ascending tracts are axons of neurons that conduct action potentials toward the brain, and descending tracts contain axons of neurons that conduct action potentials away from the brain. The gray matter has the letter H shape with different horns, we call them. The posterior horns contain axons which synapse with interneurons. The anterior horns contain somatic neurons, meaning motor to voluntary responses. And the lateral horns contain autonomic neurons. The central canal is the fluid-filled space in the center of the spinal cord that will be filled with cerebrospinal fluid. So here's a look at the cross-section of the spinal cord. Here's the gray matter in that butterfly-like shape structure. In this picture down below, you can see the posterior horn will be located on the posterior or dorsal side. The anterior horn is here. And then the lateral horn is off to the sides. So coming into the spinal cord at each segment are spinal nerves, and we divide the spinal nerve into the dorsal root, coming into the posterior side of the spinal cord, and the ventral root or anterior root coming off the front of the spinal cord segment. On the dorsal root side, we have a dorsal root ganglia, which contains the cell bodies of sensory neurons. So all sensory input comes in through the dorsal root ganglia, through the dorsal root, and into the posterior horn of the gray matter. Usually that sensory neuron will synapse with an interneuron, and then a motor neuron, usually a somatic or autonomic neuron, will leave the ventral or anterior side of that spinal cord out of the ventral root and then join in the same spinal nerve off of that segment. Here's the white matter and where these columns are located: the dorsal posterior column, anterior column, and lateral column. And again, the columns are just where different axons of neurons will either ascend or descend to and from the brain. A reflex is an involuntary reaction in response to a stimulus applied to the periphery and transmitted to the central nervous system. The simplest reflex is the stretch reflex, and this occurs when muscles will contract in response to a stretching force applied to them. The knee jerk reflex or patellar reflex is a classic example of the stretch reflex, and that's what the doctor will test for when he hits your right underneath your patella with the rubber hammer. The withdrawal reflex or the flexor reflex is to remove a limb or another body part from a painful stimulus. The sensory receptors in your skin are pain receptors, and stimulation of these receptors will initiate the withdrawal reflex. So here's a look at the withdrawal reflex. For example, if you step on something painful, that stimulus will be detected by pain receptors. It will send out a stimulus through the sensory neurons, conducting an action potential to the spinal cord. The sensory neurons will synapse with interneurons in the spinal cord that will synapse with motor neurons. And the motor neuron will be excited, and it will result in contraction of the flexor muscle and withdrawal of the limb from that painful stimulus. So this will happen immediately, and we call this the withdrawal reflex, to withdraw a limb or a muscle from some sort of pain. Spinal nerves will arise along the spinal cord from the union, or kind of the merging of that dorsal root and ventral root that are coming from the spinal cord segment. They will contain axons of both sensory and somatic neurons. They're located between vertebra, so between your vertebra bones, and they're categorized by the region of the vertebral column from which it emerges. So C for cervical, T for thoracic, L for lumbar. You have 31 pairs of spinal nerves coming off of each side of the spinal cord, and they're organized in 3 plexuses, which are groups of spinal nerves. The cervical plexus is composed of spinal nerves C1 to C4. It will innervate muscles attached to the hyoid bone and neck. It will contain the phrenic nerve, which will innervate the diaphragm as well. The brachial plexus emerges or originates from the spinal nerves C5 to T1, and this will supply nerves to the upper limb, shoulder, and hand. So if there's ever damage to the spinal cord and it occurs below the T1 segment, the person will still have working ability of their upper limb. If there's damage to the spinal cord above C5 or somewhere within this brachial plexus range, that person could lose function to their upper limb. The lumbosacral plexus originates from spinal nerves L1 to S4 in the sacrum. This will supply nerves to the lower limb. So this is just a look at these plexuses. And again, a plexus is just a group of spinal nerves that's coming off of the spinal cord. And you can see here the spinal nerves involved and how they form each plexus. A dermatome is the area of skin supplied with sensory innervation by a pair of spinal nerves. The nerves arising from each region of the spinal cord and vertebral column supply specific regions of the body, and each of the spinal nerves except C1 has a specific cutaneous sensory distribution. And we can use the dermatomes as a way to illustrate where on the body the sensory information is coming from. So if you feel some sort of pain in the C5 dermatome in your right arm, that sensory information is coming from the spinal nerve in the C5 region of your spinal cord. So just a really interesting way that scientists, medical professionals have been able to detect sensory information from the dermatome. Then we'll talk about the brain stem, which is the area leading up to the brain. The components of the brainstem are the medulla oblongata, which is the close that will connect directly to the spinal cord, the pons, which is kind of this enlarged area in the middle, and then the midbrain is the area above the pons that will be connected directly to the brain. The medulla oblongata, the location of that is continuous with the spinal cord. It functions to regulate your heart rate, blood vessel diameter, breathing, swallowing, vomiting, hiccuping, coughing, sneezing, and balance. The pyramids within the medulla oblongata are involved in conscious control of skeletal muscle. Your pons then is located right above the medulla. It's kind of this enlarged region. It's the bridge or connection between your cerebrum, the brain, and the cerebellum, which is a separate part of the brain. It's located in your posterior compartment of the skull. And your pons helps with breathing, chewing, salivation, swallowing. And it also is a relay station between the cerebrum and the cerebellum. The midbrain is then above the pons. It helps with coordinated eye movements, pupil diameter, turning your head toward the noise. The other part about the midbrain is that it has a dorsal part that has 4 what we called colliculi, which are involved in visual, so seeing and hearing auditory reflexes. The reticular formation is scattered throughout the brain, and this will function in cyclical motor function, respiration, walking, chewing, arousing, and maintaining consciousness, and also regulating your sleep-wake cycle. So that is the function of the reticular formation, which is scattered throughout the brainstem. And then the cerebellum is in the back of the skull. It's attached to the brainstem by the cerebellar peduncles. The characteristic cerebellum literally means little brain. Its cortex is composed of little gyri, sulci depressions, and gray matter. And the functions of the cerebellum are to control balance, muscle tone, and coordination of fine motor skills. And if we look back at this picture, here's the cerebellum located in the back, kind of posterior lower region. And again, it'll be connected back to the pons. And then we'll go over the other structures of the brain now. But the cerebellum is located in the back lower region. The diencephalon is located between the brainstem and the cerebrum. And the cerebrum is this part of the brain up here, all of these brain folds. And in the diencephalon, it's composed of your thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the epithalamus. And you can see the thalamus is located kind of dead center in the brain, and the hypothalamus is located right below it. The epithalamus isn't shown on this picture, but it's kind of located right here behind the thalamus. The thalamus is the largest part of that diencephalon. It influences mood and detects pain. We sometimes call the thalamus, it's the major relay station for all sensory information. All sensory information gets sent to the thalamus, and the thalamus kind of moves on that sensory information to the exact part of the brain that it should go to. The epithalamus is located above or behind the thalamus, and it functions in emotional and visceral response to odors. And then the hypothalamus is located directly below the thalamus, and it will control your pituitary gland. It will be connected to it by the infundibulum, which is kind of a stalk or a branch of brain tissue. And your hypothalamus will control a lot of endocrine or hormonal functions in homeostasis, body temperature, thirst, hunger, fear, rage, sexual emotions. So here's another look at the diencephalon. You can see the thalamus is divided into these two kind of modular halves. The epithalamus is located kind of right behind it there. It involves the pineal gland. And then the hypothalamus is located right underneath the thalamus. The cerebrum characteristics, the cerebrum is the largest portion of the brain. It's divided into a right and a left hemisphere or half, and that's separated by the longitudinal fissure. There's different lobes of the brain, which are named for what skeletal bone they'll be underneath. So here's the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe. They are separated by the central sulcus, which is an indentation between the two. The temporal lobe will be underneath your temporal bone. The occipital lobe is in the back of the cerebrum. And then the insula is a fifth lobe, and it would be located, if we were to remove parts of the temporal and frontal lobe, you would see the insula kind of around where your thalamus would be. The cerebral cortex is the surface of the cerebrum. So the surface of the cerebrum is composed entirely of gray matter, and we call that the cerebral cortex. This will control your thinking, communicating, remembering, understanding, and will initiate involuntary movements. Gyri, or a gyrus for singular, is any sort of brain fold on the cerebral cortex that increases surface area. A sulci is a shallow indentation between gyri, and a fissure is a very deep or prominent indentation between gyri or brain folds. The left hemisphere controls the right side of the body. It is responsible for math, analytics, speech. So this is why some people say you're more left-brained than right-brained. The right brain controls the left side of the body, and it's responsible for more music, art, and abstract ideas. And the corpus callosum is the connection piece between the two hemispheres. So you can decide for yourself if your left hemisphere is a little more active, or if your right hemisphere is a little more active. I'm definitely a little more probably left-brained. The frontal lobe is the lobe in front. It functions to control voluntary motor functions, aggression, mood, smell. The parietal lobe are the lobes at the top and kind of on the sides. They function to evaluate sensory input like touch, pain, pressure, temperature, and taste. The occipital lobe is in the back, and the primary function of the occipital lobe is vision. In the temporal lobe on the sides of the brain, their primary function is hearing, smell, and memory. The cerebrum then itself, again, is divided into a right hemisphere and a left hemisphere with a longitudinal fissure, which is a prominent dividing between the two. And then these are the gyri, the folds of the cerebrum, with the sulci or sulcus are indentations. And the central sulcus is a little bit more prominent indentation between gyri, and that will separate out the parietal from the frontal lobe. So here's just another look at the cerebrum. You can review this anatomy on your own. We'll most likely be going over this anatomy in lab too. Sensory function. So your central nervous system is constantly receiving all sensory input, whether that's from outside the body or inside the body. We are usually unaware of most sensory input. The sensory input, though, is vital of our survival and normal functions, because once your body knows what is happening around it, it is able to initiate some sort of response to maintain any sort of homeostasis. Ascending tracts are ascending pathways of sensory tracts. They carry impulses up the spinal cord to specific areas of the brain, and each tract will be specific to a limited type of sensory input, like pain, temperature, touch, position of your body joints and limbs in relation to others, and pressure. These tracts are usually given composite names that indicate their origin and termination. And the names of ascending tracts usually begin with the prefix spino, indicating that they will begin in the spinal cord, such as the spinothalamic ascending tract. Sensory tracts will typically cross from one side of the body in the spinal cord or brainstem to the other side of the body. And we call that crossing of sensory tracts decussation or decussating. The left side of the brain receives sensory input from the right side of the body and vice versa. So here's a look at ascending spinal cord tracts. They're all named for kind of where they're located in the spinal cord in those white columns, and also where they originate, whether it's the spinocerebellar, spinothalamic tract. And again, these are all ascending tracts that bring sensory information to the brain. Here's a look at the dorsal column ascending tract. You can see here that some sort of receptor will sense a stimulus and will send up that information, and it will cross over. So if it's sensed on the left side of the body, it'll cross over or decussate in the medulla oblongata and then be sent up through the brain. And again, it usually, as always, goes to the thalamus first, and from the thalamus will send it off to the specific part of the brain where it goes, specifically the somatic sensory cortex, because we're dealing with all sensory information. So the primary sensory areas, these are where the ascending tracts will project, where sensations are perceived, and the primary somatic sensory cortex is the general sensory area in the parietal lobe. And the sensory input that goes here is such as pain, temperature, and pressure. Somatic motor neurons will innervate skeletal muscles, and the somatic motor system is responsible for maintaining the body's posture, balance, moving the trunk, head, limbs, tongue, and eyes, and communicating through facial expressions and speech. Reflexes are always mediated through the spinal cord and brainstem. They're responsible for some body movements that are involuntary. Voluntary movements are consciously activated to achieve a specific goal, like walking or typing. Voluntary movements will result from the stimulation of these neural or neuron circuits that consist of two motor neurons, an upper and a lower motor neuron. An upper motor neuron will have cell bodies in the cerebral cortex of the brain, and they will project down the spinal cord to synapse with lower motor neurons. Lower motor neurons have cell bodies in the anterior horn of the spinal cord gray matter or in the cranial nerve nuclei. And the axons of lower motor neurons leave your central nervous system and will extend through your spinal or cranial nerves to your skeletal muscles. The motor areas of the cerebral cortex are the primary motor cortex, which is in the frontal lobe. This will control all voluntary motor movement of your skeletal muscles. The premotor area is also in the frontal lobe, and that is where motor functions are organized before they get sent off or initiated. And the prefrontal area is responsible for motivation and foresight to plan and initiate movement. So here are where the sensory and motor areas of the cerebral cortex are located. And again, all motor areas are located in the frontal lobe, and sensory areas are located in the parietal lobe. And here's the primary somatic sensory cortex in darker green and the primary motor cortex in dark purple. You can also see here where you'll have a taste area, a visual association area, motor speech area, sensory speech area, auditory association area, primary auditory cortex. So the point of all this is your brain is an incredibly intricate organ, and it's just really fascinating if you're really interested in it. Then the descending tracts, these will be motor tracts. They carry impulses down the spinal cord. They'll terminate there or in the brainstem. The corticospinal tracts are considered direct because they will extend directly from an upper motor neuron in the cerebral cortex to a lower motor neuron in the spinal cord. Some tracts are considered indirect because they originate in the brainstem, but they're indirectly controlled by the cerebral cortex, the basal nuclei, and the cerebellum. Tracts in the lateral columns are most important for controlling goal-directed limb movements like reaching, manipulating, and tracts in your ventral column, such as the reticulospinal tract, are most important for maintaining posture, balance, and limb position through their control of the neck, the trunk, and the proximal limb muscles. So these descending tracts will cross over, so their axons will cross in the brainstem or the spinal cord to the opposite side of the body, and that's typical of descending pathways as well. So this is true, so your left side of your brain will control skeletal muscles on the right side of the body and vice versa. And this is just showing where these tracts will be located, again in the white matter, and each tract will go to a different part of the body, but all of these will be motor tracts, and they're descending tracts coming from some area in the brain down the spinal cord. Here's an example of a direct motor tract, again showing where the upper motor neuron is and the lower motor neuron, going right to the skeletal muscle. Basal nuclei, so what do we mean when we say basal nuclei? Basically, it's just a group of functionally related nuclei or nucleuses from cells. They will plan, organize, and coordinate motor movements and posture. And we have two types. The corpus striatum is deep in the cerebrum, and the substantia nigra is in the midbrain. So this is where these basal nuclei are located, the corpus striatum and the substantia nigra in the midbrain. Speech is mainly controlled in the left hemisphere in the sensory speech or Wernicke area in the parietal lobe. This is where words are heard and comprehended. And motor speech is in the Broca's area, which is in the frontal lobe, and this is where words will be formulated. Brainwaves and consciousness. Brainwaves are used to diagnose and determine treatment for various types of brain disorders. And we can use an electroencephalogram, an EEG, where we place electrodes on a patient's scalp to monitor their brain electrical activity. And we can see where parts of the brains are not necessarily responding to a stimulus and be able to gauge where within that person's brain is the problem. There's different brain waves. Alpha waves will occur when the person is awake but quiet. Beta waves are intense mental activity. Delta waves are the deep sleep brain waves, and theta waves are only in children. So this is someone being hooked up to an electroencephalogram, an EEG. Again, there's electrodes placed on the patient's scalp, and this is how the waves will look differently as they come through the machine. Encoding, so memory has to do with encoding, which is the brief retention of sensory input received by the brain while something is scanned, evaluated, and acted up. This is also called sensory memory. It's located in the temporal lobe and it lasts less than a second. Consolidated memory is data that has been encoded. It'll be located in the temporal lobe, and we call consolidated memory your short-term memory. Your storage memory is your long-term memory, and it will last for a few minutes or it will be there permanently, and it depends on the retrieval rate, about how quickly you take it out. Retrieval has to do with how often the information is used. So if you don't use the information stored, it will eventually be lost. There's types of memory. The short-term memory, again, is information that's retained for a few seconds or minutes. It's usually just as little as 7 bits of information. Long-term memory can last for a few minutes or permanently. Episodic memory are remembering places or events. And learning memory is utilizing past memories. The limbic system and emotions. The limbic system makes up all of your olfactory, which is your smelling cortex, your certain deep cortical regions, and nuclei of the cerebrum and the diencephalon. Your limbic system will influence long-term declarative memory, emotions, visceral responses to emotions, your motivation, and your mood. A major source of sensory input to your limbic system is smell, your olfactory nerves. The limbic system will be directly connected to with your hypothalamus, which involves control of a lot of your hormones. If there's a lesion or damage to your limbic system, it can result in voracious appetite, increased, often perverse sexual activity, docility, which is the loss of normal fear and anger responses. So here's a look kind of at the limbic system, where it's located, what it all includes. Again, your olfactory cortex will be located in there, as well as kind of controlling regions of your hypothalamus, because it'll be directly related to hormone control. Meninges are the 3 connective tissue layers that surround the brain and spinal cord. The outermost, most superficial meningeal layer is the dura mater, which is the toughest of all meninges. The dura mater forms 2 layers around the brain and only 1 layer around the spinal cord. The second meningeal layer is a lot thinner, very wispy. It's called the arachnoid mater. The space between the dura and the arachnoid mater we call the subdural space. It contains a very small amount of serous fluid, and the cerebrospinal fluid and blood vessels are found in the subarachnoid space. The third meningeal membrane is the pia mater, and this is very tightly bound to the surface of the brain and the spinal cord. So you can see here the 3 meningeal layers below the skull bones, and how these 3 meningeal layers not only cover the cerebrum, but also layers of the spinal cord as well. Ventricles are fluid-filled cavities within the central nervous system. Each hemisphere of the brain has a lateral ventricle, and then the third ventricle is a smaller midline cavity located in the center of the diencephalon between the 2 halves of the thalamus and connected by foramina or holes to the lateral ventricles. The 4th ventricle is located at the base of the cerebellum. It's connected to your 3rd ventricle by a narrow canal, which we call the cerebral aqueduct. The 4th ventricle will be continuous with the central canal of the spinal cord. The 4th ventricle also opens into the subarachnoid space through foramina in its walls and roof. So here's what the brain ventricles, where they're located. They're filled with cerebrospinal fluid, and that is where they are located in the brain. So these are those ventricles I talked about being filled with cerebrospinal fluid, and CSF is important for providing a protective cushion around your central nervous system, and also providing buoyancy to the brain, so your brain isn't densely kind of compacted together. It's kind of floating within your skull. The ependymal cells located in your choroid plexuses of the ventricles will produce your CSF, and your CSF will fill all brain ventricles, the central canal of your spinal cord, and the subarachnoid space. So it will flow from your lateral ventricles into the third ventricle and then into the fourth ventricle. A small amount enters the central canal, and the cerebrospinal fluid will exit the fourth ventricle through a small opening in its wall and roof and enters the subarachnoid space. Masses of arachnoid tissue called arachnoid granulations will penetrate the superior sagittal sinus, which is a venous sinus, so veins in the longitudinal fissure, and cerebrospinal fluid will pass from the subarachnoid space into the blood through these granulations. And this takes you through the flow of the cerebrospinal fluid and how it surrounds the brain and provides a protective cushioning to the brain and helps create buoyancy within the brain. Then we'll talk about the 12 pairs of cranial nerves. They're named by Roman numerals. There's two categories of functions, either sensory and motor. Cranial nerve number 1 is a pure sensory nerve for smell, your olfactory nerve. Your optic nerve number 2 is a pure sensory nerve for vision. Number 3, oculomotor nerve, is a pure motor nerve for eye movement. Cranial nerve number 4, the trochlear nerve, is a pure motor nerve for eye movement as well. Number 5, the trigeminal, is motor and sensory. It senses pain, touch, and temperature for the eye and lower and upper jaws, and it controls motor muscles for chewing. Cranial nerve 6, your abducens, is a pure motor nerve for eye movement. The facial, number 7, is both sensory and motor. It senses tastes and motor for facial expression. 8 is a pure sensory nerve for hearing and equilibrium. 9 is both motor and sensory for taste and swallowing. And the vagus nerve is the only cranial nerve that leaves the head and neck region and travels down into your thoracic and abdominal cavities for both sensory and motor. Let's see, what are we at? 11 is accessory motor nerve for some of your muscles in the head and neck region. And the hypoglossal is a pure motor nerve for the tongue. So pause the lecture at this and you can take a look at where these cranial nerves are located. The autonomic nervous system innervates smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands. Its functions are largely controlled unconsciously, and we divide it into the sympathetic and parasympathetic division. Increased activity in your sympathetic neurons will prepare the individual for physical activity, whereas parasympathetic stimulation generally activates involuntary functions like resting and digesting. So 2 neuron series will exit from your central nervous system to effector organs in your autonomic nervous system. The first neuron is the preganglionic, and the second is the postganglionic. And they're so named because they will synapse with, the preganglionic will synapse with postganglionic neurons in ganglia, which are clusters of cell bodies within the peripheral nervous system. The sympathetic division, cell bodies of the sympathetic preganglionic neurons are in the lateral horn of the spinal cord, gray matter. They're between T1 and L2, so we sometimes call this sympathetic division the thoracolumbar division. And the axons of the preganglionic neurons will exit through ventral roots and project to either sympathetic chain ganglia or the collateral ganglia. The parasympathetic division cell bodies are located within the lateral part of the central gray matter in the regions that give rise to spinal nerves S2 to S4, and other preganglionic cell bodies of your parasympathetic division are located within your brainstem to give rise to these cranial nerves. So I'm going to let you read through this parasympathetic division on your own. This tells you where the axons will extend to in the organs. And this takes you through the somatic and autonomic nervous system. Somatic will generally go to all skeletal muscles, and autonomic nervous system goes to your viscera, your internal organs. Here's a great kind of example showing the differences between the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions and the axons from those neurons and where they're going. So again, I'd encourage you to pause the lecture at this point and just take a look at that. And that's the end for this chapter. Thanks for listening, guys. We'll see you on Thursday for class.